And I am going to introduce our illustrious guest. Hello everyone, and welcome to Public Role of the Humanities. Um, Lauren has really kindly written her last name phonetically, making me aware that in my head I've been mispronouncing it for all the years I've known her. So now I'm going to pronounce it the right way. Lauren Traczykowski is an American living in Birmingham. She started her education at Boston University studying international relations. After completing her degree and with 3 internships under her belt, the US Department of State, pretty good, Fine Gael HQ in Dublin, and Demos in London. That is quite an international set of internships, I do declare. Lauren moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the US Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, to contribute to the Hurricane Katrina response and recovery from within the Office of International Affairs. This is where her interest in natural hazards started to bloom. Lauren then moved to the UK to do an MA in International Studies, Globalization and Governance. Later, she completed a PhD in Global Ethics, focusing on the research she will present on today. Whilst, that's a very British word, I tried. Mm-hmm. While still working on her PhD, Lauren taught modules on bioethics, contemporary ethics, politics in the state, professional ethics, and medical ethics at institutions around Birmingham. Lauren now teaches at Aston University as a senior lecturer. Her main teaching is in business ethics and a newly launched PG module with a soon-to-be UG module equivalent on ethics in a crisis. Lauren is currently editing a collected work on interdisciplinary learning and teaching to be submitted to Edward Elgar Publishing later this year. That is a very accomplished human being, people. And not only that, you get to hear about a book that is seriously hot off the press. So, I mean, like, I just want to give, Lauren and I are good friends, can you tell? I want to give Lauren a big round of applause for publishing this book because it's so exciting. Lauren, I'm going to mute myself and talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Liberal Arts of Bristol. I'm very, very grateful to be here. I have a liberal arts undergraduate degree, so any chance I get to talk about liberal arts and anything interdisciplinary, I'm there. It makes so much sense, and I'm hoping you can see how I included a lot in my bio to say, look, I get it. Please know that it does all work. Even if you think it might not work in the long run, it works. And it gives you this broader understanding of what you're trying to do with your life. So yay, liberal arts. Okay, so I'll start my talk. Thank you for having me once again. You've heard my bio. You understand that I worked in domestic disaster response in the US, but a bit more on this to set the scene for how I approach the topic of my book, which is ethics law and natural hazards, the moral imperative for international intervention. My first day of my first real job, because I don't count the internships because I didn't get paid. So my first day of my first real job was in September 2009, and it was a deployment to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I was tasked with talking to US government agency partners, put together a story and a timeline of what happened when international donations to the United States government started coming in after Hurricane Katrina. In the end, over 120 countries offered assistance in terms of money, professionals like doctors, engineers, and goods. At first, they were all declined. Despite what the disaster looked like, the US government was responding as well as it could and had all of the supplies it needed. But clearly there were problems with the assumption of ability. Many people weren't getting assistance that they needed. I'll come back to this point in a bit. Within a couple of days of landfall, the US government realized that they should accept some of the assistance. I was not working for FEMA at the time, so this is all like my understanding of the situation. I came on a few weeks later when we realized that if a plan to integrate foreign assistance into the United States government didn't exist, we should probably get on that. The US government developed procedures for the integration of foreign assistance into domestic disaster response to account for regulatory and border control issues that will likely occur during a natural hazard response where national responders are overwhelmed. When I talk about regulatory and border control issues, think US is a bit litigious. Tort liability. What happens if you get a doctor over and people want to sue them because they didn't do something properly, right? So all of that had to be thought through. This plan, though, will only be used when the US government chooses to use it, and foreign responders must wait for a request and/or consent from the United States government to provide any assistance. So it still keeps the power with the national government to invite or consent to assistance. It's just now there's a mechanism for how it integrates into the disaster response. So I'll come back to problems with the United States government's response to Hurricane Katrina. Vaguely, I'm not an expert on the specifics of it. The US, despite any suggested or recognized problems with the provision of aid, was able to respond. They had the expertise, the facilities, the money to get things done. They were willing to respond, even if they messed things up. So even if they were crap in certain areas, they were responding. I'm not interested in situations where a government is able or willing to respond, even if things go wrong. Instead, I'm interested in what happens when a government is unable or unwilling to respond in the aftermath of a natural hazard. Please ask me why I say natural hazard and not natural disaster. It's very relevant. So instead of a hurricane or an earthquake or tsunami, the trigger event was like, oh, let's take a situation, right? So instead of a hurricane or an earthquake or a tsunami, the trigger event is a political decision for genocide. The international community has mechanisms, policies in place to militarily intervene, but we don't have those mechanisms in place for after a natural hazard if people are dying, starving, have no shelter. But humans are still humans, right? They're still deserving of basic human rights, water, food, security, shelter. I'm not even talking about political rights or rights to a home life. We're not even there. We're talking immediate aftermath of a natural hazard. My argument hinges on the philosophical position that all humans are morally worthy. They make claims to basic life-sustaining things, and we, those in a position to fulfill those claims, have a responsibility or duty to act. So what I do in the book is make the argument that military intervention for the purpose of natural hazard response is ethically required in some situations in which a national government is unable or unwilling to provide assistance to those affected. To that end, the international community is morally obligated to create policies which guide national governments as to when and how military intervention in response to that natural hazard should be carried out. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to assume you agree with me. You can disagree in questions and answers, that's absolutely fine. But I'm going to assume that you agree with me that we should have something in place to intervene when a national government is unable or unwilling to help its citizens in the aftermath of a natural hazard. Just war principle. Anybody studying international relations, politics, anything of the like, you should have at least heard of the just war policy, just war principles. It's ancient. You should hear about it. So the first thing I'll talk about, policy based on just war principles. I'm going to ask for this to be a little interactive now. So I'm going to ask you questions, pardon my lecturer mode, but I'll start us off, okay? The first principle that I talk about is not specifically one of the just war principles, but it kind of sets the situation for when we can talk about just war principles. Inability or unwillingness of a government to respond. It's the government's responsibility to support its people. But what if they aren't? In the book, I use the case of Myanmar during Cyclone Nargis, but let's go for an imaginary scenario. Do you remember, I don't know if you would have been alive during this, but bear with, a tsunami hit Sri Lanka, the Boxing Day tsunami, right? Let's imagine, God forbid, but let's imagine another tsunami hits Sri Lanka, but this time it wipes out Colombo, the capital. There's no government left to make requests to the international community for assistance. This I would class as an inability of a government to respond. We can imagine a government is loath to accept international assistance. Oh, we don't want them coming to invade our country, or they'll disrupt our way of life. We got this, we have the power. Or even, we will help the people we want to help. Nobody's going to tell us who we have to help. This, in my explanation, would be something along the lines of an unwilling to respond to a natural hazard, or unwilling to respond to the needs of its people. Right now, we have to let the national government do its thing. Under different international laws and policies, we got to go, okay, that's up to you. We can go, please, please take assistance, but ultimately it's up to them, and there's nothing else we can do. We can offer help, but they have to accept it before we can intervene. So now I want to talk about the just war principles, or the just war foundations, that I base my suggested policy on, and how I address what I argue is a gap in international policy. I'll give a definition of traditional just war, and then I'll ask you my question. Traditional just war theory holds that self-defense is the only morally justifiable reason for going to war. However, modern just war theory allows for a broader range of justifications. For example, it's been argued that a just war may be waged in defense of socially basic human rights, in addition to the traditional view. So things like genocide, large-scale human rights abuses, humanitarian emergencies, they're all considered socially basic human rights, but natural hazards are removed. They are individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for when going to war. So here's my interactive part. I'd like anybody who knows any of the just war principles, and we can talk it through in the scenario that I gave you with Sri Lanka, right? So what would be a reason, a just war reason, for intervening in Colombo, forcing assistance into the country to save the people affected by the most recent tsunami? Can anybody give me one of the just war principles? Don't worry, I wait my 30 seconds. Karen, do you know any? Can you think of any?
I don't know any. I actually don't know anything about just war principles, which
okay.
I think it might be helpful to give us a little bit.
I will. So I'll start. Okay. So one of the first just war principles, one of the reasons that is necessary and altogether sufficient for justifying going to war, a just cause, right? You have to have a reason for going to war, and that has to be deemed as just. So a lot of times what we use when we're going to decide to go to war or to do a humanitarian intervention is something called the genocide threshold. And the genocide threshold is the number of people that have to die before we say enough. This is a genocide. Now, the number, we don't use a number. It's not quantifiable. And the reason that it's not quantifiable is that genocide isn't just a big group of people. It's also a way of life, or a society, or a culture. And so if that culture only has 20 people, well, then a genocide might be 2 people, because that's 10% of the population. So they can't give a number. And if they give a number, that also suggests that we're just waiting for 5 more people to die, and then we can call it a genocide and do something. My God, those poor 5 people. So it's not a number, it's a threshold where it shocks the conscience of humankind, and we go, all right, that's enough. This is going to qualify. It's that imminent threat to life and welfare on a mass scale that likewise qualifies as a just cause for intervention. So what I would say is that if there's enough people dying in Sri Lanka, and you go, look, this is absurd now, and we all talk about it in the international community, and we can talk about how we justify this and when we get to different just war principles, but we go, okay, that's enough. There's too many people dying. We have to do something. It's a cause, a just cause for intervening. Go ahead. Yes, Karen.
Oh, I just want to ask in terms of how, so it's not quantifiable, but does it have an intellectual component, or does it rely on a kind of emotional element? So I'll just give as an example, one of the things that really struck me with what was going on in Syria was when that picture showed up of the young boy washed up to shore. And that seemed to be a turning point in the reaction. And it was a very emotional reaction because it didn't change the number of people who were dying, didn't change what the government was doing, but it was an iconic image that I felt changed the emotional reaction to what was going on. So I'm just wondering, like, when people are making these decisions, or maybe part of the question is who's making the decision, but how do we characterize that impetus?
Yeah, instead of emotion, I'm going to use the word political will.
Okay.
Right. And so when the political will swings in a certain way, it's easier to justify one of the other just war criteria. So right intention. What are we actually doing this for? And if it's just to stop a dictator, well, that might not actually be a right intention. But if it's this recognition that children are dying on beaches and we have a duty to humanity, and that's what we have to do, then they might be able to justify right intention. And so it's not necessarily emotion, although, I mean, what is political will except, this unconscious understanding of a situation? So I'll talk about right intention as the next one. The other thing to say is that it's not just, oh, okay, we have to go do this now. We have this emotion or political will. The criteria for doing any kind of intervention are jointly sufficient and necessary. So you can't just have a good intention of going. You have to tick off all of them in order to be jointly sufficient and necessary to go in. So I'll talk about right intention. It's not given simply as a cover for the pursuit of other aims. My right intentions are if it will provide the goods associated with the human right to welfare for those suffering in the aftermath of a natural hazard. I go, look, people deserve food, they deserve water, they deserve shelter and security. And that's the right intention. Yeah, it might help the political situation. It might do some other great things, but that's the right intention we're looking for in the aftermath. Advantages have been contested either at the time of decision or after. Natty, I'm going to get to that question if they've been contested, because we can think about the Iraq War, and that the right intention at the time, we have to stop weapons of mass destruction, wasn't actually the intention. We found out later. So yes, they have been contested after the fact. But all we have to go on at the time is, are people acting on their right intentions? I'm going to just talk a little bit more on right intention. Dobos addresses the possibility of ulterior motives, right? We see this in Iraq in humanitarian interventions. He explains that all of the intentions associated with an intervention need not be selfless. Self-interest can be a part of the reason for a state to intervene into another state. However, a right intention must exist amongst the justifications offered for intervention to satisfy this necessary just war condition. Well, oil isn't really a just intention, right? Finding weapons of mass destruction is a just intention. You can satisfy your self-interest, but there has to be this other thing going on. Now, again, together they're sufficient and necessary together. So yeah, okay, let's say it's one of many. It's also oil, it's also, power in that area of the world. But does the right intention exist amongst them? Okay, maybe it does. Let's talk about it. Still have to tick all the other boxes for just war principles, or just war doctrine. So the next one I talk about is proportionality, the quantifiable restrictions on an intervention. Proportionality is best understood in terms of whether obtaining some object X, if the good outweighs the bad. The relevant good of a natural hazard intervention would be the enjoyment of the human right to welfare, the avoidance of suffering, and the avoidance of death. But getting that has to be proportionately better than other situations, other opportunities. So if I'm going in to save 2 people from genocide or 2 people from a natural hazard event, I can't risk the lives of 200 of my people. That's not proportionate. And so it feels uncomfortable, but you're like, but they're dying. Their lives aren't worth any less than these lives. No, but is it a proportionate response? We can also talk about proportionate responses as to the type of weapons used when we go to war, right? But when we're doing a humanitarian intervention, will intervening actually be a bigger disruption to that country than the earthquake that happened? Are we saying that we're going to go in, oh, like this village is cut off, they don't have food, they don't have water, and you're like, yeah, that's fine. But what will an intervention do? Will it actually put, 15 villages at risk of being cut off in some way? And that's why the proportionality has to be brought in there. And so while I'm arguing for intervention in natural hazard situations, I'm going, it should be quite rare. It's going to be hard to qualify under these conditions. Another just war condition is last resort. There has to be no other way. Clausewitz, I hope everybody's heard of Clausewitz if you've studied IR, war is politics by other means. You can't risk the lives of those doing the intervention, nor further risk those suffering in the first place. There must be another way, right? Airdrops, pushing things at a border, diplomacy, of course. But if those fail, we should be prepared to do something else. It should be the ultimate last resort. I argue for military intervention as opposed to just regular intervention, just humanitarian aid, because my assumption is that they don't want this aid coming in. The country doesn't want this aid for whatever reason. And so the government will either respond with force, or at that point, there's a vacuum and there's lawlessness going on. And so it's really to protect those doing an intervention that we send people in with military support. Going to continue with my just war ones. Right authority, there's two parts: to decide to do an intervention and then to do the actual intervention. And you have to have a right authority to do both. Any international law students? Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows for international action, requires international consensus for any type of intervention or declaration of war. The UN Security Council, for example, has the authority to authorize an intervention and override sovereignty when the members have come to a collective decision. Once again, this authority was established by international consensus when the UN Charter was originally established. Great. I'm interested a little bit more in the moral, because no international laws exist for natural hazard intervention. So making the ethical and moral justification in order to create a legal structure. Walzer suggests that multilateral authorization lends moral legitimacy to an intervention, as it will minimize the imperialist or selfish tendencies of individual states. A cosmopolitan approach, any political theorists, to intervention would also support the need for multilateral authorization. Archibugi suggests that an intervention should be decided by those without coercive power. He continues that an intervention should be carried out by those who may lose more from intervening than those on whose behalf the intervention was carried out, by a UN institution or under the UN flag. This will provide moral legitimacy to the intervention because the authority stems from institutionalized norms of cosmopolitan justice pertaining to right authority. Additionally, being held accountable to one's peers will ensure that motivations are checked. Think collective moral will. Let me see which ones I've missed, because I've scrolled around a little bit. Just cause, last resort, consequences. Okay, so then the last one I'll talk about is, before you decide whether an intervention for natural hazard response is just, we have to look at long-term consequences. Human rights are the highest moral concern. Does the good involved in ensuring this right is upheld outweigh all the bad? Think of this as a consequentialist concern. Any ethicists? Total good minus total bad has to be better than any other option. Any intervention should be done to provide for the welfare of individuals affected. There are relative long-term consequences at a regional level that need to be considered, and perpetuating state power and regional dynamics which maintain stability cannot be done at the expense of human welfare. For example, it's unjust to intervene in order to remove a dictator from power. The final category of long-term implications that need to be considered: global political and economic stability. How does this apply to the regime together with the Great? Okay, I'm going to come back to that one. For example, in the aftermath of the Sri Lankan tsunami, thousands of kilos of rice were donated to the country. While this rice was intended to stop the suffering of those affected, it wasn't useful. That much rice would likely flood the local market, making it impossible for local farmers to sell their rice. Those offering assistance didn't consider the global political and economic stability, and results were disastrous. The long-term consequences of providing that assistance to Sri Lanka after their real tsunami were not considered. Instead of providing assistance in this way, we must develop a policy that takes the need of every human possibly affected into consideration, and therefore considers all of the just war criterion when developing a policy. So now I've given you the just war conditions. I've said that humans matter and the type of emergency, genocide versus earthquake, shouldn't matter. But still, you can hopefully think of some objections to my argument. I see some questions coming up, so I feel like a question and answer time might be relevant, if that's okay. Ask questions in general, whatever you want. If you have an objection to what I suggest, I'd love to hear it, and we can argue it out. So should I go to the questions? Is that all right? Let me open that up.
Yeah, why don't you start with the questions, and then people can start to put together more thoughts in terms of, and also I'm going to come in just as a warning to ask you about why natural hazard and not disaster, but I'm saving it, so don't answer that.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so Mark, you wrote in, all ways of resolving the problem should have been tried first. How can these options be exhausted in the short time scale of a response to a natural hazard? So the case study I use in the book is Myanmar, and there was a cyclone Nargis, and people were dying, and the Burmese government were not getting aid to very specific communities. And it was about a week of conversations. International aid is on the ground. The Red Cross, you'd be amazed, is everywhere already. And so if they're already on the ground, they're kind of trying to get into the disaster situation, into the area. The problem that was happening in Myanmar was that visas and travel passes were being denied to the international aid organizations that were in the area. And so the feedback was already coming through that it was difficult to get aid to these groups. And then you have the international community going, you just had a cyclone 20 minutes ago. Here's all this aid. What would you like? And it was being declined. And so I think the options to be exhausted, it is a problem, but we do it in other situations, right? So we know what was the recent, it's the 10-year anniversary of Japan and the tsunami and nuclear power plant. And we know how fast we can get aid in and we can offer it. The other options have to be known ahead of time. And that's why I argue for a policy. It's almost like there should be a way to just put a checklist together, at least a structured checklist of, okay, did we try diplomatic efforts? Have they denied offers from international aid organizations? You should be able to go through a process and go, okay, they're ignoring aid. And we know from people on the ground that this is happening. Now let's talk about intervening. Is that okay? Does that answer? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Have any just war theories ever been contested? I got that one. Very good. How does this apply to the regime in North Korea? Together with the Great Famine, which is still going on despite the recent testing of missiles falling near Japan and numerous human rights breaches, what do you think is missing for internet to be provided in the East Asian country? Daniela, I'm trying to see if your camera's on. No. Here's the thing. What's happening in North Korea is not a natural hazard. What's happening in North Korea is actually a political issue. And I would actually argue that famine is a long-term issue, a long-term disaster that has a lot of socio-political, economical issues involved in it. It's not a sudden onset issue. And so North Korea should be handled by the existing political and international systems that we already work through with political problems. But if you think about it in terms of just war principles and just war conditions, we start to see that there are actually reasons, whether or not they're all justified, but there are reasons for not just going, screw this, we're going in. Because if there is a response from North Korea, well, is that protecting the people that we're using to go in the first place? What if they do use something like nuclear weapons? Have we actually destabilized the world by trying to help that one country? And so I think that it's much more complicated than clearly there's human rights issues. I don't know the North Korea situation, and so I can't say that, all that. But clearly if there's human rights issues, and clearly if there's political problems and famine going on, but going in is much more complicated and exhausting all other mechanisms, and looking for long-term peace is a bit more complicated than just going, okay, we intervene. It's not a fun answer, I'm sorry. Okay, what about the Muslim concentration camps in China? Well, I have a dissertation student working on this, so I'm reading a little bit about it as well. The Muslim concentration camps in China, not a natural hazard. So outside the parameters of my research, disclaimer right there. But what I would say is they don't have full evidence yet, or like what's the word, attributable evidence that they're happening. And so you have to get real evidence that it's happening. I'm not saying that it's not happening. I'm just saying you have to be able to justify that it is happening in order to make any kind of just intervention or just war principles, right? And so with that as well, have we exhausted all of diplomatic efforts and things? And genocide falls under genocide, concentration camps, and what's happening to the Uyghur, I know how to spell it, I just can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, Uyghur Muslims. I would actually say, look to the responsibility to protect doctrine. Natural hazards were purposely taken out of the responsibility to protect doctrine because it was seen as too many reasons to do an intervention. So they're like, well, we'll just take that out. But I would say that what's happening in China with those camps would qualify under responsibility to protect. And so when you ask the question about whether or not we should intervene or we should do something, you have to see if it satisfies the responsibility to protect criteria, and not the just war and not the natural hazard ones. Is that okay? That works? Cool. How would you ensure that actions taken by foreign military are limited to the hazard? Yes. Authorizing it in 2001 is still in place and has at the time been used to justify for 20 years. Yeah, it's terrible. As I also mentioned, how natural disaster relief can be used as a trigger to impose much wider social economic change that would otherwise not be accepted by the public. How would you ensure that military intervention is kept strictly limited to humanitarian relief and that the intervention is time limited? Excellent. Excellent question. Thank you very much. So when any kind of intervention is taking place, the military that goes in with like humanitarian forces has to adhere to the Oslo guidelines, and it's the way that they're legally allowed to use military forces. So like the Red Cross won't travel with military, other international aid organizations will. And so anybody that's traveling with any kind of military has to be ready to adhere to the Oslo guidelines. Now, if somebody doesn't adhere to those, that's illegal. And so I can't say that I can stop somebody from doing something illegally, but I can say, well, that's illegal, so you're not allowed to do that, and we can call you up on that. And so that's how I would monitor the use of force within country. How would you ensure that the military intervention is kept strictly limited to humanitarian relief? Well, I argue that right authority has to come from a multilateral force. And so the idea that the US has put any kind of forces in another country without multilateral authorization, that would not be allowed under what I'm arguing for. The only way that they're allowed to go in is with that. And that's what I was saying as well. Wait, let me see if I can call up my, oh, what did I do? Let me see if I can call up my quote. But it's a matter of the cosmopolitan justice aspect that I was arguing for. It should be carried out by those who may lose more from intervening than those on whose behalf the intervention was carried out. So it should have so much collective moral will that even those that might lose something are willing to put it on the line. And so, yeah, of course, you're going to want United States forces, British forces involved there because there's a lot of forces and a lot of money that comes with it. But a UN institution or under the UN flag is actually the most ethical way to do this, because you guarantee that those participating really mean it and really mean it for the right intentions with the right authority. But if we don't talk about these just war principles now, we run the risk of everything you've set out, because that is the problem, right? But we have to make sure that if we put a plan in place, that we can actually do something with it. We can try it. We can make sure the intentions and the authority are all correct. I'm going back to the questions. I see a hand up. Emma, did you want to come in? And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just kind of picking up on that comment as well, and I was thinking about issues around climate justice. I have a few friends working on at different stages, and I was wondering how your kind of conceptualization of illegal intervention on the behalf of a natural hazard maybe links up with more longer term goals of climate justice, especially in terms of multilateralism. And then I have another part as well, which is about the idea that maybe when cosmopolitan ideas around justice break down, there's not an international consensus, or there's obstacles in the way, such as the intervention of someone like Russia or other. How does that also impact on the outcome of such appeals for interventionism?
So the climate justice one, again, interestingly, I purposely keep climate justice out because it's a long-term issue. It's not something that has a sudden onset environmental hazard that triggers the event, right? And so with that, there are more economic, political issues going on that I don't know if last resort would ever be able to be achieved, because you're going, well, it's just, it keeps going. And so we have to do collective effort and collective will. And so I don't think that the climate crisis is something that can be addressed by any kind of intervention, especially not a military intervention, because of that long-term ongoing status, multi-hazards, different political issues, different economic issues, how the issue actually moves across borders, things like that. So I don't think that climate justice can be considered with what I'm suggesting. That said, I was talking to some colleagues the other day, and refugee crises and how refugee human rights aren't supported. So if I don't know the current situation, but about a month ago in Bosnia, there was a massive snowstorm. It was, sub-zero temperatures in Fahrenheit or Celsius, whichever one you want to use, sub-zero. It was freezing, and people were in refugee camps, and the Bosnian government refused to open the one building that had heaters. And so there's suggestions that refugee crises might be something that is sudden onset. And there's movements with refugee situations. And a colleague of mine said, maybe that's your in to the international community, is looking at natural hazards through the window of refugee crises, because they can be sudden onset issues. You might just all of a sudden have a mass migration of people, in addition to climate refugees and things like that. And sorry, your second question, sorry, say it again.
It was just about the potentiality for blockages at like the level of multilateral.
And you said, what if Russia is the one that decides to go in and stuff? Yeah, I think that problem exists no matter what we're doing, and I can't see why we accept that problem for genocide, humanitarian emergencies, large-scale human rights abuses, but we go, oh no, a tsunami mass death, that's just too much. It suggests that the humans affected aren't worthy of the same consideration. And so I don't necessarily have an answer off the top of my head for that, but I don't think that's a reason not to explore it. Whatever solution we find for the other ones, we can just bring that over too. Was this applied to the pandemic, or could it be? can you clarify and say, well, nothing was applied, but if you get into power, please, read the book and make a policy and put it into power, put it in place. That'd be lovely. I'd appreciate it. Was this applied to the pandemic? No, but I'm trying to understand what aspect, what part of it you're asking for. Oh, no. Why would it be? Go ahead. Yeah. Hello.
Hi. Thank you, by the way.
Yeah.
Because I know that there was multiple European military forces like getting involved in the whole pandemic situation. So I was wondering if that was done, on this sort of basis, or if it was.
Well, so any European country that used their military within their own country, that's them. Because to the best of my knowledge, I didn't see any like British military going to Spain or something like that kind of cross border. And in that way, it's not an intervention. It's them using military force within their own country in order to enforce pandemic regulations or quarantining or something like that. That's a whole nother can of worms about what if that takes away rights, if that suggests that a military is now in charge. What about my liberty? That it's an absolute thing that we need to consider and worry about. I mean, the idea of pandemic ethics in general need much more fleshing out, especially now that we see it in the modern day global society. But no, military intervention didn't happen. One reason, we'd be putting our soldiers at risk if we sent them to another country. And then you go, well, is this actually wise? Does this fit the just war criteria? Because we're actually exposing them to the same problem that we're trying to fix. So yeah, I wouldn't suggest a military intervention for something like a pandemic, unless it was contained within a country. We had a vaccine. We send people to help with Ebola, but they're also requested and consented in.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's pretty interesting. Thank you.
Oh yeah. Countries ask for international aid for Ebola, and we send, and it's usually sent with military because the military is very good at logistics. So it's not even about whether or not they're good. I mean, they're very, very good doctors, definitely, because they're used to wartime situations, but they're also very good with logistics. And so we're going into country, setting up a tent, setting up an order for how things are going to happen, managing surgeries, using a utilitarian ethic for triage. They're very orderly about it. And so most often you'll see national militaries go in for any kind of localized pandemics.
Oh, okay.
Could I ask on that?
Yeah.
So carrying on with the coronavirus pandemic, so Brazil has every region is now over 95% of ICU units are occupied. So everywhere is red zone. And of course, the leadership have been notoriously anti-mask, anti-vaccine. So leadership almost working against its own, the social and human rights of its country.
Yeah.
So at what point would that, then fit into the just war criteria? So
that pandemic situations, again, are not covered in what I'm suggesting because they're not sudden onset, because we're at a year now of like actually dealing with the actual event over and over. It's not like it crashes, it explodes, it's done. And then we're dealing with the knock-on effects, but rather it's a continuously morphing situation, just like climate justice. But what I would suggest about Brazil is that if we went in to intervene, what would we be going in to do? I don't think we have our own house in order. And that's not a criticism of any national government. I don't think we have our own house in order to be able to go, come on, clearly this is how you save people. And so I don't know if proportionality, long-term consequences, I don't think that we could actually justify any kind of intervention, because what are we trying to achieve? We can feed people, we can keep them like under roofs and stuff, but they already have that. I agree that there is some
the medical system itself. So it's the same situation we saw in Northern Italy in the very early stages, where the whole health system as a fundamental part of the country's infrastructure is overwhelmed. So it's not trying to solve the pandemic, it's trying to solve a specific infrastructure issue in the country.
At which point it's a humanitarian emergency, look to R2P, look to the responsibility to protect. Because with a humanitarian emergency, we can actually look at long-term structural issues that are causing, like that kind of thing. Humanitarian emergencies are the entire health system has fallen down, right? Or the entire government has fallen down and can't deliver on the normal set of governance that they would normally have. So I would say that would qualify more as a humanitarian emergency. Yeah, we keep offering assistance because that's what we have to do, and we have to get Brazil to consent. It would have to hit the requirements of responsibility to protect in order to do any kind of deployment in Brazil for the pandemic. And again, I think we could help with healthcare systems, but that means that we're going into do not just humanitarian response, but long-term international aid, like something that UK Aid or USAID's Office of Coordination, USAID for Agency for International Development. It would be things like projects that they would do, because you can't just go in and go, oh, your infrastructure fell down. Here, we're going to prop it back up. So I think that it would be RTP, responsibility to protect, and it would be a different kind of assistance that's required. Military, I mean, sure, maybe, but it would be up to what they're actually planning to do on the ground. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Skenazy, yes.
First of all, Lauren, I want to tell you that I am not young, and I have never taken an international relations class. I have never taken a law class. No, that's not true. I haven't taken law since 11th grade.
Nice.
Okay. I have not taken any philosophy.
Yeah.
Or ethics. So first of all, I want to tell you that I've been listening very hard because it's very new to me, and it's possible that it's new to a lot of our students. Because, our program doesn't include the law school or politics or international relations. But some of them may have, gone on a year abroad or done other things and
A-levels.
Exactly. So I'm just learning a ton. I wanted to put it out there, and I suspect a lot of us are learning a ton. We do have philosophy as part of our program. So yeah, I wanted to just start by saying, I'm learning, I'm listening, I've got a bunch of new terms in my toolkit. So thank you, that's huge for me. And I did want to come back to that terminology, because part of what I'm doing right as I'm listening to you is kind of adding these terms. What is the difference? So even when you talked about humanitarian, right, that's a separate situation. So each of these, I'm understanding, have their own set of criteria. So go back to that question I wanted to ask you, which is the difference between a hazard and a disaster. And I have an idea of what the difference might be, but it would be better to hear you define.
I was going to say, tell me what you think the difference is.
I mean, I guess it's in terms of, I don't know. I think hazard. So hazard suggests some kind of future danger, right? It has a different element, is like something bad just happened.
Yeah.
And hazard suggests to me it continues to be dangerous somehow, or there's an immediate danger that might be different from a disaster that happened.
So the immediate part is what I'll pick out, right? Okay. So a hazard is the earthquake, the tsunami, the volcanic eruption. It's the trigger event. Now, there's a movement within the disaster community, and it's called disasters are not natural. Okay, because a natural hazard happens. We have volcanic eruptions. They happen because the earth has decided to let off a bit of steam, right? That's natural. A disaster occurs when a trigger event comes into contact with a socio-political economic situation that means that everything falls down. So you can have a flood and not have a disaster. And the reason that it's so important to say that it's a natural hazard that I'm talking about and not the disaster. But notice, so the title of my book is Ethics, Law, and Natural Hazards, Moral Intervention Post-Disaster. I'm not suggesting that anytime there's an earthquake, we do an intervention. I'm saying that once that hazard causes a disaster, that's when we need to start talking. Izzy next to Izzy? Yes.
I'm India.
Hello.
Wait, so does that mean that hazards are always natural, or can a hazard be like a non-natural event that just can move into like a disaster event?
Yeah, a hazard is anything, right? A natural hazard is what we qualify as like the earthquake, volcano, tsunami, anything like that. So a natural hazard is a certain category of hazards, but a hazard will be the trigger event, something that causes the next thing.
Okay.
And so,
Chernobyl would not be a natural hazard. It would just be a hazard.
It would be a hazard that caused a disaster. And the reason it caused a disaster was because the Ukraine didn't respond, didn't tell the world, didn't protect its people, sent in workers that were expendable. It was all of these other things because with Japan, they contained the nuclear power plant going off. So, I mean, yeah, it was an emergency, but I don't know if it was a disaster. I don't know if they actually contained it so well that we worry that it was a disastrous situation. Chernobyl, yeah. But Japan contained it, told the world, made sure everything was all together. So with a natural hazard, it's really important to also suggest or understand that disasters are not natural. Disasters are because we suck. Because our systems, our way of being, our way of responding to things is not enough. We haven't thought everything through. We allow people to live in poverty. In Louisiana, we allow people to live below sea level, next to a dam that hasn't been fixed for years. And you're going, how is that acceptable? Of course, there's going to be flooding. And the disaster happens because we didn't think about the people in poverty, the people that couldn't leave, the people that weren't going to want to leave. The natural hazard, yeah, it was bad. The Hurricane Katrina was bad, but it wouldn't have caused the level of disaster if we didn't suck as much as we did. We being humanity, nobody in particular. I was thinking, I'm looking at Daniela's question. Does that answer your question, Karen? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I was thinking more in terms of the clear threat that North Korea has become for other countries like Japan, which seems like they could be hit by a nuclear weapon any day now. Are we just waiting for millions to die so we can call it a disaster before we act? I'm not suggesting we start a war with North Korea. I'm just very curious about your view on this. Again, outside my purview. But what I would say is so hard. And now that I know you haven't studied international relations or politics, mutually assured destruction, the MAD concept, mutually assured destruction, is that we have to be careful not to do something, because if we do something, then somebody else is going to do something. And so we can't, it's brinksmanship is the other term, right? And so what's happening now is a bit of brinksmanship, bringing everybody right to the edge, because nobody actually wants to cross over. And so, yeah, it does feel like that. And it is that concerning place to be in, that like, well, what happens if there is somebody just goes, you know what, screw it, we're sending the nuclear weapons. It's absolutely possible, but it's been the policy for nuclear weapons since what, the 1980s, 1970s? When did START treaty start? Probably the 1970s, of how we understand we just have to keep a status quo in order to keep people in their boxes. And it doesn't feel great and it's not okay. But if we do even just a little bit more, the concern is that we'll push them over the edge and cause nuclear war. So with how it fits with just war theories and just war things is proportionality. I mean, what if we do that, if we do invade North Korea, is it worth the possible nuclear war? No. So I think that's where it would fit in my mind, at least. But again, that would be something more along other international, I think it would just fall under UN declaration in different areas of international law.
sadly, I think we have run out of time for more questions, but clearly everyone is super interested and is going to run out and buy this book. I'm going to say on Kindle because I saw the price in hardcover.
Yeah. Yeah. Or actually, you can recommend it to the library and the library will buy it. And then everybody gets an ebook. Then you can just access the ebook for free, students. Just access for free ebooks.
Perfect. All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was very interesting. Totally different from last week. We've had like quite I think a pretty fabulous lineup thus far, and this has been just brand new.
What did you have last week?
Last week we had a historian who talked about his communal obligations and how they came head to head with his research.
Oh wow! Okay.
So it's very different. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. It's always lovely to see you. I know you have questions about your assessment, which I promise I'm going to do some work around, and I will get that to you. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I will see everybody soon, including you, Lauren, in person.
Yes. Thank you all for the questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Lauren. Cheers.
Bye. Thanks. Hi.
Hi. Oh.
Hi. I just thought I would say goodbye.